Hello everyone and welcome back to our class. Today we're starting a new topic, we're starting a new chapter. It's the famine. So a lot of you will know about the famine, but we're going to actually take a quick study of the famine and see how it came to place. So the dates that we're going to be looking at is between the years 1845 and 1851, and in today's class we're going to be taking a look at life in Ireland before the famine. Now, before we get started, as always, we're going to start with our learning outcomes. So by the end of today's class, we should know the different groups of people who lived in Ireland during the time of the famine. We should also know two facts about the workhouses or about our workhouse. And we should also know four causes for the Great Famine. Just after seeing these numbers are a bit odd, so I might go back and redo them again. So what did Ireland look like during the famine, or sorry, before the famine? So in the 40 years leading up to the famine, I just show you a census that was taken back in 1801, and Ireland had around 5 million in its population. Now, in 40 years, by the year 1841, that population had increased to 8.2 million, which is an increase of 3.2 million. Now, this is a huge increase in the population, and if we think about our society that we live in today, in our industrial society, in the Republic of Ireland, there's roughly around 4.7 million, and in Northern Ireland, there's 1.8 million, giving us a total of 6.5 million. So, if you think about it, during the famine, there was 8.2 million. So Ireland would have been a lot higher population, or would have had a higher population. So how was this population distributed throughout Ireland? So as we know now, our main hubs for population will be Dublin, Cork, Belfast, but we also have hubs over in like Limerick, Galway, all around the country. Now, primarily back in the 19th century, the population was actually in the countryside. So it was on this side of Ireland as opposed to the main capital or the main counties. So the majority of people lived in the countryside. Now there was only three main hubs of or cities that would have been bigger than the population of 50,000, and they were Cork City, Dublin City, and Belfast. So those three hubs were the main ones that were over 50,000. Now 50,000 in today's standard is only the size of a town. Even Ballincollig, I'd say, would have more than 50,000. So it's interesting to see how population has changed from the countryside into the cities. Okay, so who were the people that lived within this or within the countryside? So we know about how the cities kind of looked, but we're going to take a look today about the countryside and how it was broken down. So who owned a majority of this land? Now, the answer to that is landlords. So landlords took up the majority of this country or the countryside land, and they controlled thousands upon thousands of acres. One landlord could own up to 70 to 80,000 acres of land. Now, the majority of landlords, though, which would have been, I think there was around 20,000 landlords in Ireland at the time, and the majority of them owned between 2,000 to 4,000 acres of land. Now, to give you a sense of the size of that, 1 acre of land is the equivalent to one football pitch. Okay, so if you think of a football pitch, that's roughly 1 acre of land. Now, not all of these landlords lived in Ireland. So we have what's called an absentee landlord, where they would have either lived in Dublin or Belfast. The majority of them still lived in England, but they still controlled over their lands and they had someone taking care of them. But if the landlord lived in Ireland, they would have what's called a big house. Okay, so this would have been kind of like Fota House. If you've ever seen Fota House, that would have been what you would have considered the big house. And the family would have lived there and everything would have been controlled from it. Okay, so this would have been their large estate. Now, they obviously would have rented out the different land around the area and they would have leased it. But I think Fota House was actually controlled by a Welsh family that came over in the Norman invasions, but we can look into that a bit later. But yeah, so the majority of landlords controlled the land or the countryside in Ireland at the time. Now, the majority of landlords didn't want to actually do the business of controlling the different farms and the different lands. So what they would do is they would sublet their large estates out to what was called a middleman. Now, a middleman is a person that would come along and say, okay, you have 1,000 acres. I want to rent, say, 200 acres off you. And they sublet 100 or 200 acres, and then they basically rent it out to someone else for a higher price so that they get to take in a profit. Now, this was quite common in Ireland at the time because a lot of absentee landlords didn't want to have to do all the work. So middlemen would come in and control their lands for them, make sure that they were well maintained and that they were getting their rents on time. And this way it made it a lot easier for the landlords, and it also provided an income for the middlemen. So this was a very profitable job at the time. Now, tenant farmers were the farmers who would rent land from middlemen and also rent it from landlords. Now, I think this word actually stemmed from tenths, which we learned in the plantations, where a tenth was that they would have to pay a tenth of their land, or sorry, they'd have to give a tenth of their crops over to the actual landlords or over to the king or queen. Okay, so that's, I think, where tenant farmers came from, that word. Now, tenant farmers were divided into two subsections. We had large farmers and we had small farmers. Now, large farmers had more than 30 acres, so they had a very substantial farm. They also hired labourers to help them on their farm. They would have lived in two-story houses, and their children would have also received some form of an education. Okay, now this education wouldn't be up to the standard that you're getting educated at, but it would have been an education to read and write. Small farmers then would have had anything from 5 to 30 acres. They would have had a very small farm. They would have lived in small thatched cottages. So they would have had tiny small houses. They would have grown crops just to sell them and to survive, and they would have also grown potatoes to eat. So they were dependent on their own crops also. Now, another important person to know about is a person called a cottier. Now, a cottier would rent a small plot of land from a tenant farmer, usually around an acre, where they could work for the tenant farmer while living on the land. Now, a cottier was also given a small patch of land where they could grow their own crops, such as potatoes, close enough to the small plot of land where they would live. Okay, so primarily this would have been a labourer that would have came in to help on the farm, carry out any jobs that the tenant farmer needed to get done, and in return they would have a place to live and a small bit of land to grow their own crops. And the last group of people we're going to talk about is landless laborers. Now, these were people that they didn't have any work on farms, they had no work during the winter, and they would have rented rooms in lodges and houses or lived in mud cabins outside the towns, okay, the local towns. Now, these people would have traveled around looking for work, looking for odd jobs around the place, and they were usually would move from town to town trying to move with any work that was available. Now, they were called scalpings. Okay, so that's another important one to know. Now, just to give you a visual, just to make this a bit more understandable, on the top of the pecking order, we would have had landlords. Now, landlords would have been the people who owned the different acres of land, so they might have owned 80,000 acres of land. They would have sublet this land down to a middleman, and the middleman would have distributed to different farmers to take back in rent. So the middleman would have distributed it down to large tenant farmers and small tenant farmers, and then it was up to them to actually get yield from the land. Now, a large tenant farmer would usually have a cottier on his land, where he'd have a conacre, or he might even give him a full acre. Sorry, a conacre is like a half an acre, it's not a full acre. Um, but they would be given a small plot of land where they could build their own house and grow their own crops, and a cottier would have lived there all year round. A large tenant farmer might also use a wandering labourer or a scalpine to give them a small bit of hand during the summer seasons when they had a lot of work to get done. while a small tenant farmer couldn't afford to have a cottier on the land because they would usually only be renting from 5 to 30 acres of land. So to give up 1 acre land would be very, very expensive and it'd be very foolish. So a small tenant farmer would usually employ landless laborers or scalpings onto their land just to give them a handout to work on the land. Now, just to bear in mind too, this pecking order was also in reverse how people were affected, or the people that were affected the hardest during the famine. So the landless laborers and the people that weren't working during the winter, the scalpings, they were first hit, and then it would have been the cottiers, the small tenant farmers, the large tenant farmers, the middlemen, and the landlords really didn't see too much of an effect from the famine. Okay, so here is a division of the landlord's land, just to kind of put it into perspective. So a landlord would have owned all this land, this giant square, and this would have been around 50,000 acres. Now, this would have been divided up then by the middleman, and the middleman would have said, okay, a large tenant farmer, we will give him this giant plot here. This tenant farmer is paying a small bit less, so we'll give him this land, and so on and so forth. Then the large tenant farmer might say, okay, I need a helper or a worker on my land, so I'm going to employ a cottier and I'm going to give him 1 small acre of my land to live there, but that's his to keep, but that's as soon or that's the provided that he works for me. Then a small tenant farmer might be divided into small sections like this, or even smaller again, depending on how much rent they're willing to pay. Okay, so this is just to kind of give you an overview of how the division of land would work. Now, Ireland prior to the famine was desperately, desperately poor country. Okay, so even the main cities such as Cork and Dublin were very, very poor and underdeveloped. Now, one of the only countries in Ireland that's seen any prosper during this time would have been Belfast because of their industrialization through the Industrial Revolution that we just studied. So Belfast would have had a lot of trade and a lot of business coming from England, and this is how Belfast was industrialized way sooner than the rest of Ireland. Now, 7 out of 10 families didn't have enough food, and there was around 1.5 million people emigrated from Ireland to the likes of England, America, Australia, well before the famine. Now, this is one of the most important parts of the famine, and we'll be getting into it a bit sooner, or sorry, in later classes, and that is the potato crop. Now, as you know, whenever you think of the famine, you think of the potato crop failing and how this led to its one prime or Ireland's primary food source failing. Okay, now in 1920 and also in 1930, the potato crop had failed. So it, during the famine, this wasn't the main time that the potato crop failed. It wasn't the only time that the potato crop failed. It had failed twice prior before this, and probably even more that weren't documented. But the two times we do know of came as a warning sign to say what was going to happen, and this is should have been a wake up sign or a call sign to show them that you shouldn't just depend on one food source. Okay. Now, with this great poverty came the Poor Law. Now, the Poor Law was established in 1838, and it was what led to this work or the workhouses being set up. Now, it's important here to kind of jump back a bit and have a quick think of our class that we did on the 1798 rebellion. And in one of our last classes in the 1798 rebellion, we'll remember that the Act of Union was set up in 1801. Now, for those of you who remember, the Act of Union was basically when law was no longer set up in College Green in Dublin, and all power went over to Westminster in England, giving the English full control over Ireland and let the English dictate how Ireland should be controlled. Now, with the rise in poverty in Ireland during during 1838, the English decided to set up the Poor Law, which was to introduce 130 workhouses and to establish them around the country. Now, you might think that these were a great idea and that it was fantastic, but when the first workhouses that were set up in 1841, we quickly realized how horrific these places were. So when you got sent to one of these workhouses, it would have been, say, if your crops failed or if you got kicked out of your house, if you were evicted, if you couldn't pay the rents anymore, you would be sent to one of these workhouses. Now, in these workhouses, they were almost like prisons, where men would go one way, women would go another way, and children would go another way. You were totally separated from your whole family, and you couldn't meet them again. So you weren't allowed to meet up with them or talk with them while you were in the workhouse. Now, in these workhouses, the conditions were very poor, very bad, okay? But they were only a small bit better than starving on the streets. So they provided food in, and in return you would be used to actually work. Now they didn't want these workhouses competing with local industries, so they would have gotten people in workhouses to do jobs that were meaningless. So jobs such as breaking down rock, and jobs such as breaking down corn and wheat, and that would have been their jobs. They wouldn't have allowed them in the sewing mills or anything that would compete with local industries. These were just meaningless kind of tasks that they would set upon these people so that they would feel discouraged to ever going into a workhouse. Now I'm just conscious of the time as this video has gone on for 16 minutes so far, so I'm just going to bring it to an end for today's class. By now you should know the different groups that of people that lived in Ireland during the famine and before the famine. You should have a good idea of how Ireland would have looked prior to the famine or leading up to it. You should also know two facts about the workhouses, whether it be about the tasks that they would have done on a daily basis, whether it be the segregation and how people were divided up, or how the Act of Union had such a strong role to play with the actual setting up of the workhouses. We haven't got on to knowing the four causes of the Great Famine. I will continue them in our next class, but we just didn't get enough time to do it today. Okay guys, best of luck with everything and I'll talk to you soon.